The jack-o'-lanterns on Maple Grove Drive had been burning since dusk, their carved grins catching the cold October wind. Lucas Bennett stood on his porch and watched his son Ethan climb the front steps in a silver astronaut suit, the helmet tucked under one arm, a plastic pumpkin bucket stuffed with candy dragging at the other. 47 pieces, Ethan announced, holding up the bucket like evidence. I counted twice. That's a lot of sugar for a school night. Lucas reached out and ruffled the boy's hair. It's Halloween, Dad. Fair point. Lucas was 39 years old and looked it not in a tired way, but in the way of a man who had lived fully inside each of those years. There were lines at the corners of his eyes and a faint scar on his left hand from a soldering iron he'd been careless with a decade ago. He ran a small electronics repair shop out of a converted garage 2 blocks away, a place called Bennett Fix-It that smelled permanently of solder and old circuit boards. The work was steady, if not lucrative. He had his son. He had a house with a porch he was slowly refinishing. It was enough. It had been enough for 5 years, since Hannah died. He got Ethan showered, negotiated a ceiling of 3 pieces of candy, listened to a detailed account of which houses gave out the good stuff versus the little boxes of raisins that were, in Ethan's precise words, a crime against Halloween. By 9 o'clock, the boy was asleep, the astronaut suit folded on the chair by his bed, the bucket of candy sitting on his nightstand like a trophy. Lucas poured himself a glass of water and stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the string of orange lights he'd hung along the fence. The neighborhood had gone quiet. A dog barked somewhere down the block. Leaves moved in the dark. He was about to turn off the porch light when he heard the knock. Not the tentative, apologetic knock of someone who wasn't sure they had the right address. A real knock. 3 times. Deliberate. The woman standing on his porch was his neighbor from the gray house at the end of the cul-de-sac. Claire Donovan. She'd moved in 8 months ago and they'd exchanged maybe a dozen words, total a wave from across driveways. A brief conversation about a package left on the wrong porch one morning when she'd asked if he knew a good plumber. She was 36, he knew, because she'd mentioned it once in passing, the way people do when they're trying to contextualize something. She worked remotely, some kind of data analysis. She kept to herself in a way that didn't seem unfriendly, more like practiced. But right now she looked like someone the night had chewed up. Her mascara had tracked down in thin black lines below both eyes. She was wearing a dark wool coat over what looked like pajamas, and her hands were wrapped around each other in a knot at her chest, the way people hold themselves when they're trying to keep something in. I'm sorry, she said immediately. I know it's late. I know this is I'm sorry. It's fine. Lucas pushed the door open wider. Do you want to come in? She looked past him into the house, then back at him. There was something in her expression he couldn't name. Not quite desperation. Something older than that. I need to ask you something, she said, and I need you to hear it without reacting first. Can you do that? I can try. She took a breath. The porch light caught the wetness on her cheeks. I want a baby, she said, and I need someone to help me. I'm asking you. Lucas stood very still. Behind him, somewhere upstairs, the house creaked the way old houses do its own small punctuation. He didn't slam the door. He didn't ask her to leave. He said the only honest thing he could manage. You'd better come in. She sat at his kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a mug of tea he'd made without asking whether she wanted it. Because sometimes people need to be given something warm to hold before they can say anything at all. He'd made himself a glass of water and sat across from her, and there was a moment where neither of them said anything, and the silence was occupied by the settling sounds of the house and, distantly, a car with a sound system passing 2 blocks over. 7 years ago, Claire said, it was Halloween. My daughter was 4. Her name was Sophie. My husband Daniel was driving us home from a party. She paused. A truck ran a red light on Route 9. Daniel died at the scene. Sophie died in the hospital 3 days later. Lucas didn't say he was sorry. He'd learned, after Hannah, that the word meant almost nothing at the scale of certain losses. Instead, he just held his glass of water and let the silence be what it needed to be. After that, I got very good at functioning, Claire continued. I went back to work. I moved twice. I was in therapy for 4 years, and I'm not ashamed of that. I built something that looked like a life from the outside. She looked down into her mug. I tried IVF 2 years ago, a clinic in Portland. 3 rounds. None of them worked. The doctor said my odds weren't 0, but they were honest about what they were. Why are you telling me this? Because you deserve the whole truth if I'm asking you anything. She looked up. And because I think you understand loss in a way that a lot of people don't. That landed somewhere specific. Lucas set down his glass. Hannah, he said. My wife, ovarian cancer. She was 33, Ethan was 4. Claire nodded slowly. I didn't know her name. No. There's no reason you would. They sat with that for a moment. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a group of late trick-or-treaters passed on the sidewalk, their laughter fading. I'm not asking you for a relationship, Claire said carefully. I'm not asking you to love me or pretend to. I'm asking if you'd be willing to be the biological father of a child I would raise. I have savings. I have a stable income. I've thought about this for 2 years, and I'm not making this decision out of grief. I know what grief looks like when it's driving, and this isn't it. She paused, but I needed to ask someone I could look in the eye. Someone whose character I've had time to observe, even from a distance. And you're a good father, Lucas. I see that from my kitchen window. He was quiet for a long time. I'm not saying no, he said finally, but I'm not saying yes tonight. That's fair. I need to think. I need to think about Ethan, and about the practical reality of what you're describing, and about whether I'm someone who can hold that much complexity steadily. That's what I'd want you to think about, Claire said. Not whether it would make me happy. That's not what I'm asking you to carry. He looked at her. You're very clear about what you're not asking for. I've had a lot of time to figure out what I actually need versus what I just want. She paused. They're not always the same thing. No, Lucas agreed. They're not. He stood on the porch until the lights in the gray house came on. First in the hallway, then in the kitchen, the warm rectangles of them falling out onto the lawn. He stood there until the cold got into his collar, and then he went inside and stood in the kitchen for a while, not doing anything in particular, just being in the room. He didn't sleep. He lay on his back in the dark and stared at the ceiling fan, which was still because it was October and he hadn't switched it on in weeks. The room was quiet, in the way rooms get quiet when a person has lived alone in them long enough. A specific, textured silence that has its own weight. He thought about Ethan first, which was right. It was always Ethan first. His son was 9 years old, and had his mother's eyes and Lucas's stubbornness and a quality of self-possession that sometimes made Lucas think the boy had arrived in the world already knowing something the rest of them were, still trying to figure out. Ethan was fine. Ethan was better than fine. But fine could be a kind of ceiling, and Lucas had spent 5 years aware of that ceiling, the ways it protected them both and the ways it pressed down. He thought about money. The shop was reliable but thin-margined. He'd put away a modest amount each month since Hannah died, out of a discipline that felt less like prudence and more like something to control when everything else was uncontrollable. He was not, by any accounting, in a position to take on financial risk. He thought about Hannah. Not the last months, which he'd spent years carefully not thinking about too directly. He thought about the way she used to read on the couch with her feet tucked under her, and the specific sound of her laugh when something genuinely surprised her. He thought about whether she would be horrified, or whether she would, and this was the thought that caught him off guard, whether she would understand. Hannah had been someone who believed that people deserved to have their lives back. She'd said that about a friend of theirs once, a woman who'd lost a pregnancy, and she'd said it with such conviction that Lucas had known she meant it as a general principle. He thought about what Claire had said. I see that from my kitchen window. It was not a small thing, to be seen doing the ordinary work of parenthood and to have it matter to someone. Most of what he did for Ethan was invisible in the way that care is almost always invisible. The packed lunch, the permission slip signed at 10:30 the night before, the conversation about Marcus's passive aggression that Lucas had navigated without fully understanding what passive aggression even looked like at 9 years old, but trying anyway. He didn't need recognition for those things. But the idea that someone had watched him do them and thought, there is something worth trusting there. That landed differently than he expected. He also thought, somewhere around 1 in the morning, about what Claire had not said. She had not used the words love or loneliness or salvation. She had not implied that he owed her anything, or that his history of loss created an obligation to alleviate hers. She had been remarkably precise about what she was asking for and what she was not. He had dealt with people, clients, contractors, a former business partner who'd lasted 8 months who could not separate their wants from their expectations, who handed you their needs like a bill they expected you to pay. Claire had handed him a question, not a bill. That was different. By 2 in the morning, he understood that his hesitation wasn't revulsion. It wasn't refusal. It was fear. Which was different. He got up and made coffee he didn't need and sat at the kitchen table in the dark, and somewhere around 3, he thought, I'm not saying no because I can't. I'm saying I need to understand what I'd be agreeing to. That's not the same thing. He thought about what it would mean to say yes, and how the shape of their days would change, and how change was the thing he'd spent 5 years carefully controlling, keeping it small and predictable, because unpredictable change was what had taken Hannah, and he'd learned at the most expensive possible cost that he had no authority over the events that mattered most. He had arranged his life around what he could control: the shop, the house, Ethan's schedule, the orange lights along the fence. These were not small things. But they were also not everything. It was the most honest thought he'd had all night. He went over the next morning, a Saturday, at 9:30. The jack-o'-lanterns on the neighborhood porches were starting to look a little tired in the daylight, the carved faces softening at the edges. A neighbor, 2 houses down, was already pulling hers from the porch rail and dropping it into a trash bag, which struck Lucas as somehow premature. You had at least a week before the thing started to look genuinely embarrassing. Claire answered the door in jeans and a sweater, coffee already in hand. She stepped back to let him in without making it a moment. There was something he appreciated about that she didn't perform. The gratitude of someone who'd been waiting, didn't frame the open door as a favor. She just opened it. Her house was neat in the way of someone who found order calming rather than performative. There were books everywhere, organized but not staged. A half-finished mug sat on the coffee table next to a notepad covered in handwriting. On the mantel, 2 framed photographs, a man with dark hair laughing at something outside the camera's frame, and a small girl in a yellow raincoat, maybe 3 years old, looking directly at the lens with an expression of total seriousness. He didn't look too closely. He didn't need to. I have questions, Lucas said, sitting across from her at the kitchen island. I expected you would. Legal questions first. What would my parental rights look like? What would my obligations be? Claire pulled the notepad toward her. I've thought about this. I think we'd need to draft a parenting agreement with an attorney. Something that specifies financial responsibility, visitation rights if any, decision-making authority. I'd want it in writing, not because I don't trust you, but because verbal agreements don't protect either of us when circumstances change. What if you wanted me to be involved and I wanted distance? Or the reverse? That's exactly the kind of thing the agreement would need to address before we made any decisions, not after. She met his eyes. I don't want ambiguity any more than you do. He nodded. What about your health? The IVF, what did they tell you? My ovarian reserve is low. My uterus is structurally fine. The issue is egg quality, which is age-related and progressive. The doctor said natural conception isn't impossible, but statistically unlikely for me. They were honest that the window isn't infinite. She said this without drama, which he appreciated. And what do you want from me, exactly? As a person, not legally. She was quiet for a moment. Honesty. The same kind I'm trying to give you. I don't want you to agree to this because you feel sorry for me. That would be terrible for both of us. I want you to agree because you've thought about it clearly, and it makes sense to you. And if it doesn't make sense, I need you to tell me that now, not later. I have one non-negotiable, Lucas said. Tell me, Ethan. He can't be an afterthought in this. If at any point this arrangement starts to affect him negatively, his stability, his sense of who we are, anything, it stops. That's not a threat, it's just the truth. He's my first priority. He has to be. I would expect nothing less, Claire said. And I think you should know that if I had a child who was watching a parent make this decision, I'd want that parent to have exactly the priority order you just described. He looked at her across the kitchen island. Give me 2 weeks, he said. I want to talk to an attorney on my own first. Then we get one together. Then we talk about the rest. 2 weeks, she agreed. The 2 weeks turned into 3, then a month. Not because things were stalling, but because there turned out to be a lot of practical ground to cover, and some of it moved slowly in the way of legal and medical things. In the meantime, they started spending time together in the unstructured way neighbors sometimes do when proximity and circumstance overcome the default politeness. Claire came over one Tuesday night when Lucas was making pasta and Ethan was at the kitchen table working on a science fair project about electromagnets, and she ended up staying for dinner because she knew something about the relevant physics, and Ethan had questions. How do you know about magnets? Ethan asked her, skeptical in the specific way of 9-year-old boys evaluating adult credibility. I work with data, she said, but I took a lot of physics in college. Dad fixes electronics. He knows about circuits. That's related, actually. Ethan considered this. You can both help me, then. It was not a crisis moment or a turning point. It was just a Tuesday. But Lucas noticed that when Claire sat at his kitchen table explaining electromagnetic fields to his son with a pencil and a piece of graph paper, she had the focused, patient quality of someone who genuinely found teaching satisfying, not merely tolerable. He noticed other things, that she was up early, lights on in the gray house before 7 most mornings, that she waved to old Mr. Alderton across the street when she got her mail, and that the wave was warm, not perfunctory, that she did not perform cheerfulness, which he'd always found more trustworthy than people who did. He also noticed that neither of them talked about the arrangement when Ethan was present. It wasn't a rule they'd established explicitly. It was just something they both understood without needing to discuss it. The decision they were moving toward was adult territory, and the boy's world didn't need to carry it yet. When Ethan asked once why Claire came over so much now, Lucas said that they were friends, and that sometimes you became better friends with someone once you actually started spending time with them. Ethan had considered this, and said that was how it worked with Marcus too, who he thought was annoying in 2nd grade, but turned out to be the best person to sit with at lunch. Marcus had hidden depths, Claire had said, keeping her face straight. He knows literally every dinosaur, Ethan confirmed, as if this settled the matter. The jack-o'-lanterns rotted and were replaced by dried corn stalks, then by the first Christmas lights in early December. Some of the orange string lights Lucas had put up along his fence were still there, because he hadn't gotten around to taking them down and, honestly, because they looked all right against the November gray. He'd bought them at the hardware store 3 years ago for $2, and they'd lasted longer than he expected. That happened sometimes with cheap things. They surprised you. Claire gave Ethan a book about the history of space exploration for his birthday in November, which was exactly the right call. The boy read it twice in a week and started talking about the Voyager probes with an evangelical enthusiasm that required Lucas to look up several facts to keep up. She'd known to get it because she'd listened, that Tuesday in October, when Ethan had been talking about his astronaut costume and mentioned, offhandedly, that he wasn't really interested in being an astronaut, but he liked the idea of things going very far away and still sending back signals. Lucas had heard Ethan say that and not quite processed it. Claire had remembered it a month later when she was looking for a birthday present. He noted this without drawing conclusions from it, but he noted it. He told Ethan on a Saturday morning in early December, sitting at the breakfast table over eggs and toast. He'd thought about the timing carefully, not too tired, not rushed, not on the way to somewhere else, just the ordinary stillness of a weekend morning. "There's something I need to talk to you about," Lucas said. "Something I've been thinking about for a while." Ethan looked up from his toast with the particular alertness of a child who has learned that certain tones of voice mean something real is coming. "You know Claire. From the Gray House. She helped me with the magnet project." "Right. She and I have been talking about something big." Lucas paused. "Claire would very much like to have a baby. She doesn't have a husband or a partner, and she's asked if I might be willing to help her, as the father of the child. Not in the way you have a dad, but biologically, the way the child came into the world." Ethan was quiet for long enough that Lucas started to worry he'd explained it wrong. "Would it be my brother?" Ethan said finally. "Or sister? Half. Biologically half." Lucas watched his son's face. "How does that make you feel?" "I don't know yet." Ethan picked up his fork and put it down again. "Would the baby live with Claire?" "Yes. Claire would raise the baby. I'd have some involvement, but the baby would be hers. Would you be over there a lot? I'd be honest with you about that. I don't know exactly what it looks like yet." Ethan thought about this with the visible, painstaking concentration he brought to things that mattered to him. Then, is Mom in heaven worried about this? It was the question Lucas had not known was coming, and it hit him cleanly in the chest. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I've thought about what she might think. I believe she'd want good things for both of us. For you and me, I believe she was that kind of person." "She was," Ethan said, with the certainty of someone who had decided this and would not be reconsidering it. They sat for a while. Then Ethan said, "Are you happy, Dad? Like, actually?" Lucas looked at his son. "More than I was." "Yes, then maybe it's okay," Ethan said. He picked his fork back up. "Can I have more orange juice?" The attorney's name was Patricia Wren, and she had an office downtown that smelled of good coffee and old wood, and she had clearly done this kind of work before, which Lucas found reassuring. She did not perform discomfort or approval. She asked questions and wrote things down and explained the implications of various choices in plain language. The co-parenting agreement they drafted over 3 sessions took care of the things that needed to be taken care of. Financial responsibility was Claire's, with no expectation of support from Lucas. Visitation rights were defined but not mandatory. Lucas could be present in the child's life at the level that made sense, with structure to prevent ambiguity from becoming conflict. Decision-making authority for medical and educational matters rested primarily with Claire, with a provision for consultation. All of this was contingent on a 30-day review period after the child's first birthday, at which point either party could request modifications. "There's a clause I want included," Lucas said at the second session. "If this arrangement is determined to be negatively affecting my son emotionally, practically, in terms of his home stability, I have the right to request a formal review and restructuring of my involvement level." Patricia Wren made a note without comment. Claire had not objected to the clause. She'd said, quietly, "That seems right." He'd looked at her then, across the conference table, and thought, "She means it. She's not agreeing to get past this point. She means it." Outside the attorney's office, in the parking lot in December cold, Claire said, "I want to tell you something I probably should have said earlier." "Okay." "When I came to your door on Halloween, I had been sitting in my house for 6 hours. I'd been looking at Sophie's picture and Daniel's picture, and I'd gotten to that place where the grief isn't sharp anymore. It's just heavy. And I'd been thinking about the IVF and the doctors and the odds, and I walked out of my house before I could talk myself out of it." She paused. "What I'm saying is that I didn't plan it as carefully as it might have looked, and I wanted you to know that, because you deserve to know who you're dealing with. You walked out of your house and asked your neighbor something terrifying," Lucas said. "I think that actually tells me more good things about you than a plan would have." She looked at him for a moment. Then, she got in her car. They had discussed the medical logistics carefully. with the same deliberateness they'd applied to the legal ones. There had been a conversation with Claire's doctor about timing. There had been a conversation between the two of them about what felt honest versus what felt clinical versus what they were both, in different ways, afraid of. They had decided not to use a clinical facility. Not because of the cost, though that was a factor, but because something about the deliberateness of it, the scheduled appointment, the fluorescent light had felt wrong to both of them independently, and when they admitted that to each other, it had been a small relief. What Lucas remembered afterward was not what might have been expected. He remembered that Claire had put on music, something instrumental, low, and that neither of them had pretended the situation wasn't strange, because it was strange, and pretending otherwise would have been its own kind of dishonesty. He remembered that they had both been nervous in a way that felt appropriate rather than shameful. He remembered thinking, in the middle of it, that Hannah had always said the bravest thing a person could do was try for something knowing you might not get it. He drove home at 10 o'clock on a Thursday night in January. Ethan was asleep. The orange lights along the fence were still up. He sat on the porch in the cold for a while, not thinking about anything in particular. Just the quiet street, just the lights, just the feeling of being a person who had made a decision and would now have to live inside it. He didn't feel like he had betrayed Hannah. He felt, instead, like he had finally stopped being so afraid of being alive. February was gray and long, the kind of long that accumulates differently than other months, not dramatically, just steadily, like a bill you haven't opened yet. Claire went about her days with the particular contained quality of someone who has done all they can do and is now at the mercy of outcomes. She went running in the mornings. He could see her from the kitchen window when he was making Ethan's lunch, a figure in a dark jacket moving down the far sidewalk, steady and unhurried. She worked. She came over for dinner on Thursdays, which had become a routine the way routines do not decided, just accumulated. One Thursday leading to another until skipping would have required an explanation. Ethan had started telling her about his week before Lucas could, rattling through the details of a math test and a disagreement with his friend Marcus about whether a hot dog was technically a sandwich, which had been occupying the third-grade philosophical landscape for almost 2 weeks. Claire listened to all of it, with the focused attention of someone who genuinely wanted to know. Lucas found himself looking at his phone too often, which was not like him. He repaired a vintage stereo receiver for a client and spent 3 hours on a circuit board that would have taken him 90 minutes under normal levels of focus. He started a book he'd been meaning to read for a year and then couldn't tell Ethan what it was about. He was in the shop on a Thursday afternoon, working on a laptop with a cracked charging port, when he realized he'd been holding the soldering iron at the ready for 4 minutes without doing anything with it. The thing he didn't say to Claire, because it didn't seem helpful, was that he was scared she would call him with bad news. Scared that they had gone through all of this, the conversations, the attorney, the careful, honest navigation of something that had no established script and that it wouldn't work, and that Claire would be left in the same place she'd started, only now with the weight of this particular attempt on top of everything else. He thought about the 3 rounds of IVF she'd described, the Portland clinic, the doctors who had been honest about the odds. He thought about what it costs to try for something, again and again, and not get it. Not in terms of money, but in terms of some internal resource that doesn't have a name but runs low all the same. He was also scared it would work. He knew that. Both things were true, and they sat in him together like a complicated piece of machinery he hadn't yet figured out how to operate. Ethan, for his part, had taken to drawing. Lucas noticed it first as a general increase in art supplies on the kitchen table, and then, one Saturday, he looked at the drawing his son was working on and saw a house, 2 houses, actually, side by side, with a figure in each window and in the yard between them, a small shape with an oversized head the way children draw children. He didn't say anything. Ethan hadn't shown it to him. He just took note. It was a Wednesday evening in early March when Claire knocked on his door. Not the hesitant knock of Halloween, but something steadier. He opened the door and looked at her face and knew before she said it. "It worked," she said. He stood there for a moment. He did not shout. He did not put his arms around her. though something in him moved in that direction. He said, "Come in a voice that was quieter than he'd intended, and then he sat down on the couch and looked at his hands and thought, "There is a child now. There is going to be a child." Claire sat in the armchair across from him. "Are you okay?" she asked. "I'm trying to catch up," he said. She nodded. "Take your time." Outside, through the window, he could see the orange lights still strung along the fence, burning steadily in the March dark. The jack-o'-lanterns were back on Maple Grove Drive. New ones, their grins fresh cut and white inside, not yet softened by the weather. Somebody had put a string of purple lights along the Hendersons' fence this year, which looked better than Lucas would have predicted. Ethan was 10 now, which he had strong opinions about. He was dressed as a pirate and had already eaten 3 pieces of candy on the walk from their driveway to Claire's front porch, which he'd reported honestly when asked, because he was that kind of kid. Claire answered the door in a flannel shirt with Lily on her hip. Lily was 7 months old and had recently discovered that humans had faces worth staring at, and she was doing that now, fixing Lucas with the particular gravity a baby brings to the act of looking. "She's heavier every time," Lucas said. "She would like you to know she's been practicing," Claire said. Ethan was already holding out his arms. "I can hold her on the porch swing. Keep one hand behind her head." Ethan took his half-sister with the careful seriousness he'd been applying to this since she arrived, and they settled onto the porch swing, Lily's small hand finding a grip on his pirate coat. Lucas leaned against the porch railing and watched them. He had learned, in the past 7 months, that there was no adequate category for what he was in Lily's life, and that this might be all right. He was not her father in the conventional sense. He was present. He paid attention. He had sat in a hospital waiting room while Claire was in labor, and when Patricia, one of the nurses, had asked if he was family, he had said something like that, and she had smiled as if she'd heard stranger arrangements and they'd turned out fine. Lily had his eyes. He hadn't said this to anyone, but she did. The neighborhood was filling up with the Halloween sounds he'd heard every October for the 9 years they'd lived on this street. Kids in groups, parents at the end of driveways holding coffee cups, the distant percussion of doors being knocked on and opened. A couple walked by with a toddler dressed as a small lion, and the toddler stopped on the sidewalk to look at Lily on the porch swing, with the recognition of one small creature spotting another. Claire came to stand beside him at the railing. They watched Ethan with Lily in companionable quiet, the kind that had gradually replaced the carefulness of earlier months. "Scared?" she said. He glanced at her. "Of what?" "I don't know. All of it." The way it turned out, he thought about it. He thought about the porch a year ago, and Claire in her wool coat with her mascara tracked down her cheeks, asking him something he'd never been asked before. He thought about Ethan at the kitchen table saying, "Are you happy, Dad?" He thought about the orange lights in the attorney's office, and the January night he'd sat on the cold porch and felt, for the first time in years, like he was inhabiting his life rather than maintaining it. "Terrified," he said. "But alive." Claire nodded once, slowly. Ethan said something to Lily in a low, serious voice, and Lily grabbed his thumb. Lucas went inside and got the extra jack-o'-lantern, the one he'd carved that afternoon, a slightly lopsided grin that Ethan had approved, and set it on the porch railing next to the one that had been there since morning. He stepped back and looked at them both. 2 lights on a porch on Halloween. Nothing resolved, nothing explained, just the ordinary remarkable fact of people choosing, carefully and imperfectly, to show up for each other. Down the block, a group of children rounded the corner into the glow of the streetlights. One of them was dressed as an astronaut. "That was me last year," Ethan said from the swing. "It was," Lucas said. Lily made a sound, not a word. Not yet, but something with intention in it, directed at the lights and the dark, and everything she was only beginning to understand was out there. "I know," Ethan told her. "It's a lot." Lucas stood on the porch and let it be exactly what it was.